In the spring of 1974, a man named Nigel Napier, the 14th Baron Napier and 5th Baron Ettrick, reported for his first day of work at Kensington Palace. He was 33 years old, a former army officer with service in the Scots Guards, quiet in manner, precise in habit, and by every account possessed of the kind of patience that cannot be taught. His new employer was Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, younger sister of the Queen. No one who had held the job before him lasted more than a few years. The role was formally titled Private Secretary to Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret. Informally, within the corridors of Buckingham Palace and among the household staff who traded intelligence the way diplomats trade cables, it had another name entirely. It was called the hardest job in the royal household. Lord Napier would hold that job for 28 years, longer than anyone thought possible, longer than Margaret's marriage, longer than most of the friendships she kept. When asked, decades later, how he had managed it, he offered an answer so spare it could have fit on a telegram. "One learned," he said, "what not to say." That sentence, "what not to say," is the key to understanding not just Lord Napier's survival, but the entire machinery that kept Princess Margaret's public life functioning while her private life lurched between extremes of glamour, isolation, cruelty, and charm. The role of a royal private secretary is, by design, invisible. The secretary manages the diary, handles correspondence, liaises with government officials and charities, coordinates travel, and serves as the buffer between the principal and the outside world. For the Queen, this role was occupied by some of the most capable civil servants in Britain, men like Sir Martin Charteris and Sir Robert Fellowes, who managed geopolitics and constitutional crises with the discretion of career diplomats. For Princess Margaret, the job description was the same on paper. In practice, it was something else entirely. Margaret was, by the 1960s, the most famous woman in Britain who was not the Queen. She had been a tabloid fixture since adolescence, the beautiful younger sister, the rebellious one, the princess who smoked, who drank, who danced until 3 in the morning at clubs in Mayfair, while her sister reviewed state papers at the palace. The public image was crafted from real material. Margaret was genuinely glamorous, genuinely witty, and genuinely difficult. She could light up a room and empty it within the same hour. The photographer Cecil Beaton, who adored her, described her in his published diaries as the most glamorous creature he had ever seen. The journalist Kenneth Rose, writing in his own diaries published posthumously in 2018, recorded a different observation from a Kensington Palace dinner in 1971. Margaret was in punishing form. 2 guests left before dessert. Both assessments were accurate. They described the same woman on different evenings, and sometimes on the same evening, an hour apart. Her private secretaries did not have the luxury of choosing which Margaret they would encounter on any given morning. They got whoever arrived, and the job was to make the day work regardless. The first anecdote that every biographer reaches for when describing Margaret's treatment of staff involves the telephone. In the late 1960s, her then private secretary, a position briefly held by Lord Adam Gordon before his transfer to a less volatile posting, was summoned to Kensington Palace at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Margaret had been trying to reach a friend in the country, and the line was engaged. She instructed Gordon to telephone the operator, have the line interrupted, and explain that a member of the royal family wished to speak. Gordon, according to an account later relayed to the journalist and royal biographer Hugo Vickers, and recorded in his published journals, explained that the General Post Office did not, in fact, interrupt private calls on behalf of any individual, royal or otherwise. Margaret's response was silence. The particular silence, Gordon reportedly told a colleague, that felt worse than shouting. The call was never made. Gordon did not remain in the role much longer. The incident is minor in isolation. What it reveals is the expectation, not of cruelty, but of a world in which her status should rearrange the ordinary rules, and the private secretary was the person whose job it was to explain, repeatedly, that it could not. A second episode, more widely documented, took place during an official visit to the island of Tuvalu in 1978. Margaret was representing the Queen at independence celebrations, accompanied by Lord Napier, who had by then been in the role for 4 years. The schedule called for a formal dinner hosted by the new government. Margaret arrived, surveyed the table, and declared the floral arrangements inadequate. According to Christopher Warwick, whose authorised biography, Princess Margaret, A Life of Contrasts, draws on interviews with household staff, she instructed Napier to have the flowers replaced before she would sit down. On a Pacific island with limited floristry, Napier, displaying the quality that would define his entire tenure, simply left the room, spoke with the local hosts, returned 10 minutes later with marginally different flowers, sourced, one assumes, from the same limited supply, and informed Margaret that the arrangements had been refreshed. She sat down. Dinner proceeded. The hosts were spared embarrassment. The incident captures the private secretary's true function, not to fulfill impossible demands, but to create the appearance of fulfillment while protecting everyone else in the room. The third anecdote belongs to a different register, not logistical impossibility, but social endurance. Craig Brown's Ma'am Darling, 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, published in 2017, assembles dozens of accounts from people who encountered Margaret at social gatherings. One of the most vivid comes from the writer Gore Vidal, who attended a dinner at Kensington Palace in the early 1980s. Vidal recorded the evening in a letter to a friend, later published in his collected correspondence. Margaret, he wrote, spent the first course interrogating a guest about his knowledge of Caribbean geography, correcting him on the location of Mustique, an island she knew intimately, having been given a plot of land there by her friend Colin Tennant. When the guest ventured an opinion about the local economy, Margaret cut him off. "I think you'll find," she said, "that I know rather more about it than you do." The private secretary seated nearby, almost certainly Napier, did not intervene. Vidal noted that the secretary's expression throughout was one of studied vacancy, as though he had trained himself to be present without being there. Brown's book suggests this was not an accident, but a survival skill, refined over years of witnessing exchanges that could not be interrupted and should not be acknowledged afterward. The fourth incident is documented in Theo Aronson's biography and concerns Margaret's correspondence habits. Every royal principal generates letters, thank you notes, responses to invitations, formal communications with charities and patronages. Margaret's output was, by all accounts, unpredictable. She would ignore a stack of correspondence for weeks, then demand that 30 letters be drafted and sent within a single afternoon. Aronson, drawing on interviews with former palace staff, describes a particular afternoon in 1982 when Margaret returned from lunch, a lunch that had, by her own account, gone badly, and informed Napier that every letter he had drafted that week was inadequate. She dictated replacements for each one, changing nothing of substance, but altering the phrasing in ways that reflected her mood rather than any improvement in meaning. Napier retyped them all. A junior staff member who witnessed the session later told Aronson's researchers that Napier betrayed no irritation whatsoever. "He simply did it," the staff member said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The pattern here is not Margaret's dissatisfaction. Anyone might reject a draft. It is the scale and the arbitrariness the sense that the private secretary's competence was a thing to be tested rather than trusted. The fifth anecdote from this first evidence block involves the diary. A royal diary is a complex instrument. Engagements booked months in advance, coordinated with other members of the family, dependent on the schedules of host organizations, transport logistics, and security. Margaret's relationship with her own diary was, according to multiple sources cited in Brown's book, one of sustained antagonism. She would agree to an engagement, have it confirmed, allow weeks of planning to proceed, and then cancel on the morning of the event. Kenneth Rose's diaries record a specific instance in November 1976, when Margaret withdrew from a charity gala at the Savoy, an event attended by 400 people who had purchased tickets on the understanding of her presence, citing a headache. Napier was left to telephone the organisers, absorb their frustration, and issue a statement. Rose, who was at the gala, noted that the organisers said nothing publicly, but their silence was eloquent. For the private secretary, every cancellation was a minor diplomatic incident. He bore the consequences of decisions he had not made, and he bore them repeatedly, the same cycle of commitment, reversal, and repair, month after month, year after year. But there is another side to this story, and it matters. Margaret's private secretaries did not merely survive her. Some of them understood her, and what they understood was a woman whose life had been shaped by constraints that no amount of glamour could disguise. The sympathetic case begins with the Townsend affair. In 1953, Margaret fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man who served as equerry to her late father. She was 22. The relationship was genuine, well documented in Townsend's own memoir, Time and Chance, and ultimately impossible. The Church of England would not sanction the marriage. The government would not support it. Margaret was forced to choose between the man she loved and her position in the royal family. She chose duty. In October 1955, she issued a public statement, drafted with the help of advisers, but delivered in her own voice, announcing that she would not marry Townsend. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, she said, "I have decided to put these considerations before any others." She was 25. Every private secretary who served her afterward inherited the consequences of that renunciation. A woman who had been publicly denied the one thing she wanted most, and who carried the wound of it into every room she entered for the rest of her life. The second anecdote of this more sympathetic reading concerns her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, later the Earl of Snowdon. They married in 1960, the first royal wedding broadcast on television, watched by an estimated 300 million people worldwide. The marriage was troubled almost from the start. Snowdon was brilliant, mercurial, and unfaithful. Warwick's biography documents the deterioration in clinical detail, the arguments, the infidelities on both sides, the separate bedrooms, the notes that Snowdon reportedly left around the house listing Margaret's faults. One such note, discovered by a member of the household staff and described in Anne de Courcy's biography, Snowdon, the biography, allegedly read, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." Whether the exact wording is accurate remains disputed, but the existence of the notes is confirmed by multiple sources. The private secretary during these years was navigating not just a professional relationship with Margaret, but the fallout of a disintegrating marriage. Scheduling engagements around arguments, managing press inquiries about the state of the union, maintaining the official fiction that everything was fine. Lord Napier, who arrived in the role as the marriage entered its final phase, was handling the logistics of Margaret's separation while simultaneously managing her public schedule. The divorce was finalised in 1978. Napier managed both sides of the transition with a discretion that those who worked alongside him described, in interviews given to Warwick, as remarkable. The third sympathetic anecdote concerns Margaret's health. By the 1990s, she was suffering from a series of ailments that the public knew little about. In 1998, she scalded her feet severely in a bathing accident on Mustique, an injury that left her with limited mobility and chronic pain for the remainder of her life. 2 years later, she suffered the first of several strokes. Napier, still in his role, managed the medical logistics alongside the official communications. A former member of the Kensington Palace household, quoted anonymously in Robert Hardman's Queen of Our Times, described Napier during this period as the one person who never wavered. Margaret's final years were marked by diminished capacity, reduced public appearances, and increasing isolation. The woman who had once been the most photographed princess in the world was now largely confined to Kensington Palace, attended by a reduced staff, seeing fewer visitors. Napier remained. He had outlasted the marriage, the scandals, the health crises, and the slow retreat from public life. He stayed until Margaret's death in February 2002. The fourth anecdote involves Margaret's genuine capacity for warmth, a quality that her reputation for difficulty tends to obscure. Lord Glenconner, the former Colin tenant who had given her the land on Mustique, published a memoir in 2019 titled Lady-in-Waiting, co-written with his wife and Critities Problict. The programme Rodor, he had left a little bit anyway, considered with Lady-in-Waiting and reports the reelings of Hull's problem. The fourth anecdote involves Margaret's genuine compatibility between Lady-in-Waiting course in marriage. Contact with the trans kids that he allowed from the world, they were so need onto her round whirl without court. The Lord Glenconner, the former Colin tenant who had given her the land on Mustique, considered with her round whirl without court. The Lord Glenconner had been draining from me and what innovate, in Lord Glenconner that tribly influences Lady-in-Waiting, and a lord was no recognised it for Margaret's rawm. The Trivoli was one of her real video in the last. The Trivoli was made both building and father her, the Lord Clenwaite provide from herd. The drinnen out did the Margarets from them, he was helped to deepler them and to the land of world. The Triboli was heard in appeal from Margaret's leddy, he was coming from her children and a lord for the land. The original Grand Roder, the ground round in father thing. The Trivoli was so ready, but in the Drenconners left it, in father things it been used at Triboli for the land of were out with Margaret's lead. The Drent handlant in her force, the Drenconner resist in the land or furtherty, the groups of interest is the great. The death, some people left it, in the original Conady, was bored. The dream death was so need want of the person of meat. A long trump of the death, they the develop 25 belup that was quickly from the lead at his wife Anne. In it, he describes Margaret at her best, entertaining friends on the island, singing around a piano, performing entire scenes from operas she had memorised in their original Italian. She was, Glenconner wrote, the most entertaining person I ever knew when she chose to be. The qualifier is important, when she chose to be, but the entertainment was real. Her private secretaries witnessed both modes, and several of them, including Napier, maintained genuine affection for her despite the professional difficulties. A colleague of Napier's told Hugo Vickers that the private secretary was not a martyr, he genuinely liked her. That was the part nobody believed. The revelation here is that loyalty to Margaret was not always a matter of duty. Some of it was earned. She could be extraordinary company, and the people closest to her knew it, which made the difficult days harder to bear, not easier, because they had seen what she was capable of being. The fifth and final sympathetic anecdote concerns Margaret's awareness of her own reputation. In the late 1990s, during a conversation documented by the journalist and author Tim Heald in his book Princess Margaret, A Life Unravelled, Margaret was asked by a friend whether she thought she was difficult. She considered the question. "I suppose I must be," she said. "People keep telling me so." Heald's account suggests the remark was delivered with a half-smile, self-aware but not apologetic. It was not a confession. It was an acknowledgement. Margaret knew precisely how she was perceived, and she had made a calculation, whether consciously or not, that the cost of changing was higher than the cost of continuing. Her private secretaries were the people who bore the arithmetic of that calculation most directly, and the ones who stayed did so with their eyes open. What does the accumulated evidence tell us? The story of Margaret's private secretaries is, in the end, a story about the British monarchy's relationship with the people who serve it. The system asks individuals to subordinate their lives to an institution, and it rewards them with proximity to power, but never with power itself. Margaret occupied a particular position within that system, close enough to the throne to carry its obligations, far enough from it to lack its purpose. She had the duties of a senior royal without the role that would have given those duties meaning. The Queen had a constitutional function. Margaret had engagements. The gap between the two was the space in which her frustrations lived, and her private secretaries were the people who occupied that space alongside her. They managed her diary, but the diary was, in a sense, a record of her irrelevance, an endless sequence of appearances at events that would have proceeded with or without her. The evidence does not support the simplest version of the story, which is that Margaret was merely cruel and her staff merely endured. The reality is more complicated. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine talent, musical, witty, politically aware, trapped in a role that used almost none of those qualities. The private secretaries who lasted were the ones who understood that her difficulty was not simply temperament. It was architecture. The building she lived in, the monarchy itself, had no room that was truly hers. If this account has given you a clearer picture of life behind the closed doors of Kensington Palace, subscribing to this channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one in preparation, drawing on the same biographical sources and archival material. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. There is no algorithm that reliably surfaces this kind of history, so the subscription is the most direct way to stay connected to the work. Lord Napier and Ettrick retired from Margaret's service after her death in 2002. He had entered the role at 33 and left it at 61. 28 years. In that time, he had managed a royal divorce, a succession of scandals, the slow decline of his employer's health, and the daily reality of working for a woman whose moods could shift between graciousness and fury within the span of a single conversation. He gave very few interviews. He wrote no memoir. When he did speak publicly, in brief remarks at memorial events, in the occasional quotation granted to an authorized biographer, he spoke of Margaret with respect, and more surprisingly, with fondness. He never used the word difficult. He never complained. He simply did the work, absorbed what needed absorbing, and kept the machinery turning. One learned what not to say. That was his summary of nearly 3 decades. It is a sentence that tells you everything, not about him, but about her. The measure of Princess Margaret's private life is not what was said about her in the drawing rooms and the diary columns. It is what the people closest to her learned, through long experience, to leave unsaid.